Hello, everyone. Welcome to this new episode in our new series in the future of higher education, where we are currently speaking to a range of editors in academic and commercial publishing houses to specifically talk about the world of publication and the world of publishing with aspiring academics, young scholars, to sort of demystify the whole process. It is a pleasure to have with us today Emily Tabor. Emily Tabor is the executive editor of Basic Books and Seal Press. Previously, she was also at MIT Press for about 13 years, working mostly in acquisitions. Basic Books is an academic publisher that was founded in the 1950s that has worked with famous names that we might all be familiar with, including physicist Richard Feynman, Christopher Hitchens, the cognitive scientist Douglas Hofstadter, Steven Pinker, historian Iris Chang, famous anthropologists, including Cloud Levi Strauss. So it's a real honor and pleasure to have you here today, Emily. Thank you for joining us.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So Emily, if you don't mind actually just also just doing a little bit of an introduction on your part, talking a little bit about sort of Basic Books from your angle.
Sure. Well, I would say just that Basic Books is a publisher of serious nonfiction. We are a commercial publisher. We're an imprint within Hachette Book Group, which is a major, it's one of the big five publishers. And so, what we're looking for is, experts with new ideas. That's kind of the main thing that we're looking for. And then Seal Press is an imprint of Basic, and that is that's a press that has had a really strong history of doing feminist publishing. And so that's something where, we've published books like So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo and The Memo by Minda Harts. And so Transgender History by Susan Stryker. There's a lot of really great stuff on both the Basic and Seal lists. And it's exciting to sort of join the team. I just came on just a few months ago from the MIT Press. And so it's been a sort of transition from university press publishing to commercial publishing. And so I'm happy to talk about that.
Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned earlier, the basic topic of this episode today will be to just demystify the book publishing process with, let's say, specific reference to the audience of academics who might be thinking both about commercial publishers and academic publishers. Towards this end, hopefully today we'll talk a little bit about maybe some of the differences between commercial publishing and academic publishing. But beyond that, also talk a little bit more in detail about sort of the detailed steps. So really sort of diving into some of the nitty-gritty details of the book publishing process, from sort of whether to contact an agent or an editor to questions like, what do I do with a book proposal? How do I write one? And so on and so forth. So I think a good place to start here will be to talk a little bit about the differences between commercial publishing and academic publishing, especially since, Emily, you have expertise and background in both.
Yeah. So I would say that, academic and commercial publishing, well, even just, sort of backing it up to say, what do we mean when we say academic publishing? I think that there's nonprofit presses and there are commercial publishers, and then there are academic publishers, and there are, more commercially oriented, and sort of you can mix and match a little bit. University presses are nonprofits, but often university presses will have a robust trade publishing program where they're writing books for general readers. And so you can do both an academic book and a more general interest book with, a scholarly university press. But similarly, you can do a book of academic work with a commercial publisher, if it's, a commercial publisher that publishes in that area. And you can also do, something that's, more broadly of interest to a non-academic audience with a commercial publisher. So it really just depends on, kind of what you're looking to get out of the publishing experience. I think that it's important for authors to think about what their goals are and what their metrics for success are going to be, and what kind of publisher is going to help them meet those goals. I think a classic example is if you have to write a book for tenure, it almost doesn't matter like what the world says. You should find out what your department says about, what kind of publisher should you be working with. If there's, sort of a norm around, certain publishers, like that should be your target for your proposal. As opposed to if you want to write a book because you're trying to build your brand, and set up a sort of second career as, a public speaker, or, if you have, already been doing that kind of public engagement and you want to take it to the next level with a book, a different kind of publisher would probably make sense for you. And so it's just all about, what you're hoping to get out of the process. If, selling a lot of copies of a book is important to you, then, a commercial publisher certainly would be aligned with that goal. But at the same time, you have to be realistic about, like, what is my book? And, how does my book also align with the publishing vision of these different publishers? So I think that, things like course adoption, that's a something that both commercial publishers and university presses can do. But not all commercial publishers do outreach to the, academic community. So again, you have to kind of do your research and figure out what is available. If the thing that's most important to you is having your book be, cited by senior scholars in the field, again, I think that's a question of, what's going to get their attention and where are you going to go for that? So yeah, I think that's basically it. And then there's so the other sort of big difference between commercial and academic publishers is peer review. At a university press, every project gets peer reviewed, even the ones that are for general readers. At a commercial publisher, peer review is often not baked into the process, but there's an understanding that, I think anyone who writes a book is going to have someone else read it before they, send it to their editor. And so there's often a lot of, sort of informal peer review that happens, even if it's not a formal part of the process. And certainly, your editor will also often, if it's a commercial publisher, certainly be taking a look at the manuscript and doing editing there to make sure that it's accessible for a general audience, and that you're not getting too bogged down in academic jargon, or, that you're not presenting your ideas clearly for someone who doesn't have a PhD on the topic. So there are different ways of sort of getting feedback on your project too, based on what kind of publisher you go with.
Yeah, so I want to maybe follow up a little bit on specifically sort of with a publishing house such as Basic Books, which is going to be, as you said, focusing mostly on serious nonfiction works. So in this sort of case, the general audience, how does sort of the general audience orientation of a commercial publisher intersect with, let's say, the more sort of serious intellectual orientation that the publishing house itself sort of wants to uphold?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. And, I think that when we think about, who's the reader of a basic book, it's, someone who is interested in understanding how the world works, and someone who's not afraid to kind of get into, the weeds a little bit, or, but at the same time, it's not necessarily, as I said, someone who has, an advanced degree in a topic. And so it's kind of, what are the sort of reasonable expectations for an educated general reader? I think that the sort of classic example is, someone who like reads the New York Times or listens to NPR. Those kinds of audiences, I think, are inclined to want to read, rigorous nonfiction. And I think that, with Basic, we want to sort of give the sort of complexity of the topic its due, but to still make it understandable and accessible. Like the goal is always, clear communication and understandability and readability. We want these books to be informative, but also like entertaining to read.
So from the perspective of a writer then, so we've talked a little bit about sort of, we're imagining this process where you're thinking about which editor, which publishing house to approach, but the question of audience sort of arises almost as early as when you're writing your piece. So what sort of advice do you have in terms of sort of academic writers who are considering sort of these two paths, both the commercial one and the academic, in terms of thinking about their audience at the level of writing?
So that's a great question. And I think there are a couple of things, when you're thinking about audience that are worth thinking about. First of all is, who is actually going to read this book? A lot of times I will see proposals where the author has suggested that, the audience for this book is going to be everyone, or, something like super vague, and that is unrealistic. I think it's more helpful if you can kind of drill down a little bit and think about, okay, is this a topic that is only going to be of interest to a particular academic community? Is the question one that is, small or large? Is this a question that people who are not in this academic world sort of need to know about? I think that sometimes people think that like, oh, I can just convince someone that, they should care about this particular topic. And that can be done. And I think there are some, writers out there. I think Mary Roach has done a great job in, nonfiction writing on topics that people like didn't know they needed to know about. But I also think that you have to be, sort of realistic about like, is this something that is only going to appeal to the academic community? Or is this something that, is either speaking to something that's happening in the world around us, or is, sort of a question, about, say, like human behavior or like the universe, like, are there things that people, are curious about? And then I would say too, once you've kind of figured out who your audience is, that's going to also allow you to understand how to write for them. Because if you've identified that it's, a mostly academic audience, then you can start working kind of within those parameters. There's a level of prior knowledge that you can assume your reader has. Whereas if you're writing for a more general readership, you really need to like step back and assume that your reader knows almost nothing about the topic and that you might be introducing like really fundamental facts to them. If that sounds like that's what you want to do, then that would be certainly a sign that you're writing a book for general readers. If you want to like jump ahead 6 steps and really get into the, nuts and bolts of something, then you might be writing a book that's more targeted to a particular audience.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So you mentioned earlier, you mentioned the book proposal just now, and I think this could be a good transition to sort of start talking a little bit more concretely about what the actual process is from book proposal to publication. Academics oftentimes aren't the worldliest of folk. So this would definitely be, I think, very, very valuable and practical information for everyone. So maybe we can begin by talking about the book proposal. So maybe we can, or actually, maybe we can step back and briefly outline the entire process, sort of from book proposal to publication.
Sure. So yes, I mean, the process generally starts from a publisher's perspective with a proposal. And so an author will prepare a proposal, and I will go into more detail about what that entails. But for now, it's a proposal. You send that in to, an editor, or your agent will send it to editors. The editor will take a look at it. They will, be looking for sort of fit with their list. Is this the kind of project that they are, looking for? And then if so, there will be usually some sort of further consideration process at a university press that would likely be peer review. If it's a commercial publisher, it may not be, peer review is not baked into the process, but it may involve, sharing the project with colleagues and getting feedback on it that way. And then assuming that, sort of like further consideration process, if it's peer review, if you get positive reviews, then the next step would be to, bring the project forward for contract approval. And again, assuming that that project is approved, again, most publishers have either some sort of editorial board or publishing committee, or some body of folks that get together to evaluate the proposals that editors bring forward in hopes of being able to offer a contract. And then, once you get the green light, then a contract is signed, and then the authors will, write the manuscript. In some cases, an author may already have a manuscript done. And in those cases, I think it's still useful to go through the exercise of writing a book proposal. But you can say, I have the full manuscript, and an editor may choose to send the full manuscript out for review rather than, just the proposal. But a lot of times, particularly in nonfiction, people will write the proposal first, sort of get the sign off from a publisher saying like, yes, we want to publish this, and then they'll write the book. But in any case, once you have a complete draft manuscript, if it's a university press or another scholarly publisher, there will likely be another round of review on the full manuscript itself. And if it's a commercial publisher, that's often when your editor will start, digging in and reading and offering feedback. You'll have the opportunity to revise, depending on how things go. There may be like multiple rounds of revision, but then you'll get to the point where you have a final manuscript, and that's what gets submitted to production. And that's when, the copy editing happens. That's when the typesetting happens. That's when it stops being a Word document and starts looking like a book. And the cover design, and then of course the printing and binding of the actual book itself. And I will say too that process can take a while, from sort of having a final manuscript to having a book in your hands. I would say a typical time is about a year. Different publishers may have slightly longer or shorter schedules, but I would say that's a pretty good guideline to have in your mind. But again, also, length and complexity of the book would also affect that schedule.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. So maybe let's begin by talking a little bit about the book proposal, because this is probably, especially from a sort of younger academic, early career academic, this is going to be one of the more daunting aspects of this whole thing. One question here, I think, first of all, in general, I think it'd be useful just to understand sort of what editors are looking for in a book proposal. But I think one of the big anxieties, especially from the perspective of an early career academic, is what do I have to do in order to convince someone that my book proposal, and also, I guess, myself as an author, is worth taking seriously? Mm-hmm. How do I sort of best showcase myself to an editor?
Well, I think there's a lot to unpack in that question, because I think that instead of necessarily thinking that like, oh, I have to like convince someone, to publish my book, I think that a much more useful framework is to think of it more like matchmaking. Like, you want to find the right publisher for you. And so it's not necessarily going to be that like every editor is like, oh yes, like we're all going to be fighting over this proposal and, like that kind of a thing. What you really want to find is an editor and a publisher who understands your project, who is going to support it in the ways that it needs to be supported. And so it's more about finding that alignment. Like if it's really important for you to have a really strong editorial relationship, then you want to look for a publisher that, makes time in the process for that. If it's really important for you to get review coverage or, something like that, then it's important to make sure that you have a conversation with the publicity and marketing folks, or, get some information about what that process looks like. So I think that, thinking about it in terms of like, there's so many publishers, and I would say probably like 75% of the proposals that I get, I can just immediately look at and decide like, oh, this just isn't a fit for what I'm looking for. That doesn't mean the project is bad. It just means that there are only so many projects that I can take on in a year. And this one isn't exactly what I'm looking for at this time. And that can also, change over time. There's definitely the phenomenon of, like certain topics are, sort of interest. And after a while, it's like, okay, well, I think we've kind of said all that we can say on this. And even though I've, published a lot in this area, I'm going to shift my focus to something else now. It may be that you're writing a book that is more synthetic, that you're sort of taking information from a bunch of different sources and like bundling that into something. But for a publisher who is like only looking for original research, like that's not going to fly. And it's not anything about the quality of the work. It's just, it's just not, it's a mismatch between what the author is offering and what the publisher is looking for. So I think that that's something to keep in mind, is that you're looking for the publisher who's going to like champion your work. And so finding that and having that be your goal. That said, I think there are a lot of things that you can do as an author reaching out to editors. Basic things like proofreading your proposal, making sure that when you've copy and pasted, the editor and publisher's names into the, same query letter that you're sending, that you like are sending it to the right person. I have definitely received inquiries where, someone has said like, I would like you to consider this for the name of a different publisher. And that isn't necessarily going to like be the death knell of a project. Sometimes it may be, but it's definitely a signal and not a great one. So you definitely want to just make sure that you're putting your best foot forward. If a proposal is not really sort of thought through, that can also be kind of a signal that like maybe the author doesn't have a totally clear vision of what they're trying to do. Again, if you say your audience is everyone, that's a sign to me that you haven't done enough reflecting about like who your book is for, and that the vision, hasn't completely solidified. I think it's absolutely fine for there to be sort of like open questions or things that you might want to talk about with an editor. But the vision for the book should be there. You shouldn't be approaching an editor and being like, I know this topic, tell me the book you want me to write. It's more about, I know these things, and this is this book that is, inside me that like I want to bring out into the world. And this is my vision for it. Does this align with what you're looking for?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll just follow up a little bit about that, because this description of, the book is inside me. One thing that I imagine a lot of younger, sort of less established scholars would worry about is, why would anyone believe that there's a book inside of me? So part of the, I guess what I want to ask is, for less, would it make more sense for sort of less established scholars to also be handing in some sort of existing work, so that the editor knows that it's something that there really could be a book inside of this person?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think that, part of your book proposal should include a little bit about yourself as an author. Basic information like, your current affiliation, sort of what your research interests are. But then also, if you want to include, if you've had, papers published in leading journals, or, if you've had articles or blog posts, or, things in sort of non-academic publications, particularly if you're trying to get a more trade, general reader book published, sort of having that to point to be like, I've done this before in this other context. That's always useful. I think that, a piece of the puzzle when an editor is considering a proposal is understanding, are there people who are going to buy this book because this person is the author? That's not always going to be like the number one consideration. And particularly for junior scholars, that is, something where we're looking for, who are the rising stars going to be? So you don't have to be like, the like top person in your field to get a book published. But we do want to see like, okay, this book fits into an existing research agenda. The work that you've done so far, is contributing to this. People are are curious to hear what you have to say. And you've been doing this work to kind of make yourself known and build your own network. And just, I think the image that a lot of us might have of, writing a book is someone like toiling away in like an attic or, something like that. And I think that vision is not as reflective of like today's publishing reality, where I think the most successful books are ones where authors are actively involved in getting the word out about their book. And so just having some level of indication that an author recognizes that and is willing to put in that work is also useful to include in your proposal. But again, that's not to say that if you are, early career, that like your hopes of publishing are like, smaller or anything like that. It's just that you need to show for where you are in your career that, you've been, doing things that will contribute to the book, and that you've been, making connections that are going to help get the word out about the book.
Yeah, so that's definitely incredibly important for people to hear. Sort of, especially in academia, there's sometimes an illusion that just toiling away at your work will. So the networking aspect, sort of also making sure that you're sort of publicizing yourself and so on, is surely excellent advice. So earlier you mentioned a little bit about sort of in this process of submitting your book proposal, you talked about how there might be a decision to be made about whether to work through your agent or to directly approach your editor. So can you speak a little bit about that? Sort of how do you make this decision?
So if you're hoping to have your book published by a commercial publisher, and I would say particularly like, one of the sort of big like New York publishers, and in that I'm thinking, Hachette, Penguin Random House, Macmillan, HarperCollins, like those are, sort of the big ones. And for a lot of those publishers, you do have to have an agent in order for your proposal to be considered. The agent is viewed as sort of a useful step in the vetting process, but also an agent helps authors navigate the commercial publishing landscape. And so having an agent can be useful, and in many cases is a requirement for publishing with a commercial publisher. You do not need to have an agent to publish with a university press. And so that's not to say that you like, I've definitely seen in my days at the MIT Press, agented proposals come to us. And in some cases we were competing against, commercial publishers for those books. So an agent will, that will not preclude you from being able to submit to more academic publishers, but the logic there should be that you're writing a book for general readers. Like an agent is probably unlikely to represent a research monograph that's going to appeal to like 800 people. Like that's not something that an agent is going to put their time and energy into. But if you are looking to get in contact with an editor directly, you may be wondering like, well, who do I even talk to? Like, how do I find out who the editors are? And I would say that something that's really useful to do is to think about the conferences that you go to, which are the conferences that are the most helpful for you in your research life, and look at the exhibitors at those conferences and see what publishers are there. Publishers typically go to conferences that represent like fields that they are most committed to publishing. Of course, absence at a conference does not mean that this area is not a priority, but you can be pretty confident that anyone who is there, it is a priority for them. So, if you're a historian, you want to see, who is exhibiting at history conferences. And so you can look usually online, the exhibitor list is usually on a conference website, and then you can see who's there. You can then go to those publishers' websites and find the editor who seems most aligned with what you're looking for and just send them an email. If you're actually going to be at the conference, you can always like stop by the booth and see if you can talk to the editor there. That works best for like a short conversation. If you want to have a longer conversation. If you have questions, particularly about your proposal, it may be helpful to set up an appointment with the editor ahead of time, or to, just sort of talk things through over email a little bit. But you can definitely, just, have a quick booth conversation of, oh, like, I'm working on a proposal in this area. Is this something that you would be interested in seeing? Yes, no, then that's the kind of conversation that you can just have spur of the moment at a conference. And I should say too, if you're looking to find an agent, I think one of the best places to look is to identify books that are similar to your book, sort of in topic and, intended audience. And if you read the acknowledgments of those books, people will often thank their agent by name. And so then you can look up that person online, see if they're, open to new queries, and then, take it from there. But I would say definitely looking at who is kind of active in the spaces that you hope to, be publishing in terms of your subject matter. Look at who those publishers are. And that's always a really good place to start.
The acknowledgements is a great tip. I want to circle back a little bit to the comment you made earlier about how looking for a publisher is often very much like a process of matchmaking. And one of the things that you said earlier, which made a lot of sense, was that if your audience is more academic, you probably want to go with an academic publishing house. And if you're hoping for a more general audience, then commercial publishing houses might make a little bit more sense. But within that space of sort of trying to approach a general audience, as you mentioned, there's at least one important distinction here between the big publishing houses and the small ones. And could you say a little bit more about sort of the what is afforded by smaller publishing houses, perhaps, that isn't afforded by the larger ones?
Well, I think that it's hard to say, like, blanketly, a small publisher is going to do X and a large publisher is going to do Y, because it really comes down to the priorities of each publisher, the business model that they're operating under, and sort of the niche that each publisher has identified for themselves. I know that for some small publishers, they know that they may not be able to compete financially in terms of the offers that they can make to authors, with larger publishers. And so they're going to focus more on, being very sort of boutique and author centric in terms of, having really strong editorial relationships, or, being really responsive to authors when it comes to the marketing and publicity plan. On the flip side, there are other publishers where, they're like, we're just going to, blanket the world with this book and, hope that it sells. And, that's, that's our model. So it really depends. And I think that there are publishers that, sort of at both small and large scales that, are really strong at what they do. So I think it's really a question about, again, identifying what your goals are, identifying what you want to get out of the publishing relationship, and having those conversations with publishers to see who's best in a position to support those goals.
Mm-hmm. And maybe I can just follow up by asking a little bit about how you would maybe describe the practice and the philosophy of some more like basic books. Mm-hmm. So with regards to these questions of sort of what does a publishing house that isn't exactly the your Penguin or so on, but still fairly established, and but sort of what do you guys take to be what you afford authors in terms of as a distinct, unique publishing house?
Well, I think that, certainly at Basic, one of the things that makes us unique is our attention to backlist. And those are books that are published, sort of more than 2 years ago. And when we sign on projects, we're looking to see, is this something that has legs? Is this something that people are still going to be interested in reading 5-10 years down the road? And so I think that's part of our, sort of comparative advantage. And that influences, the kinds of projects that we say yes to. If we can see like, oh, this has backlist potential, that's promising for us. Whereas if this is a book about, say, the death of Queen Elizabeth, that's not a book that we're necessarily going to do because it's tied to such a particular moment in time. A biography, of Queen Elizabeth, that would be something that I think, that would be something that people would refer back to, a historical figure. Like there's always going to be sort of interest in this topic, but something that's tied to like a particular moment in time, I think is less likely to land for us. But again, I think that every publisher has their own story, and every publisher has, the thing that makes them special. For some smaller publishers, that may be a commitment to open access publishing, for scholarly work. Again, it may be sort of a willingness to collaborate on, sort of technological sort of experiments in, sort of digital publishing or, something like that. So there's a lot of different ways that publishers can distinguish themselves from each other. And so, I think it's just, again, about finding what's the right thing for you and for your book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that again makes a ton of sense to me. So maybe we can talk just a little bit about the process. I mean, it's a long and complicated, and in most cases probably relatively arduous for the author, at least, journey between sort of getting your book proposal done and sort of actually working with the editors and with the publishing house to get that book to press. So is there any sort of key points in this journey that you think that authors are that in your experience, authors are, especially newer authors, are less familiar with, or who just like know sort of less about, that you think people would benefit from knowing at an earlier stage?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think that something that I think bedevils many authors is just because, you've never written a book before, like understanding how long it's actually going to take to do, and how to make time for that, how to, sort of protect your writing time. But then also, I think sometimes things can be unexpected. Life happens, or, you submit the draft manuscript and then the reviewers say, like, oh, there's a lot of revisions that need to be made, and you agree. That may end up then, sort of taking longer to finish. But I think just kind of generally being realistic about, how long does it take you to write a journal article, multiply that by 8 or 10 or, like whatever number of chapters there are in the book, is your book, based on, is it all original writing, or do you have a chapter or two where you're going to be, sort of drawing on insights from, maybe a journal article that you've published? Sometimes adapting something can take just as long as writing from scratch. So like, that's not even necessarily a time saving, but just to be thinking about, realistically, what is the process here? How am I going to write this book? How much time in a week am I going to be able to devote to book writing? And then to sort of do that math of like, okay, because I think that what is always most helpful to me as an editor is a realistic estimate of how long it will take to complete a manuscript, because then, we use that to sort of schedule a book and slot it into a season. And then we do a lot of planning around that. And so it's much easier to say, I think I'm going to write this book in, a year, but like, let's say 18 months, and then we can plan on that. And then if something happens, you have a little bit of a buffer. I don't think that I have ever seen a proposal and been like, ooh, I would publish this book, but the author's going to take 6 months longer than I think is ideal. Like usually that's not the deciding factor. So I think be realistic about how long you think it's going to take to write the book, and then maybe like add a little bit to that just to give yourself some working room.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this actually raises what might sound like a bit of a silly question that it's popped into my head, which is that what really, because I imagine a lot of people who might be submitting a book proposal might also have the question of just like, what exactly would constitute a book? So even in those sort of few volumes that are behind you right now, we have much smaller books and much bigger books.
Yes.
I guess the question is, and again, I imagine this will differ from publisher to publisher, but maybe one general, I want to ask sort of a general question to allay some potential anxieties about how big of a project do I have to be thinking about in order to be taken seriously?
So yeah, so I think it's useful to think about it in terms of like the question that your book is going to answer. Is this a question that is relatively straightforward? Is it pretty well sort of bounded? Or do you need to really draw in, many other fields to make sense of it? Are you looking at something like, at Basic, we just published Brad DeLong's Slouching Towards Utopia. It's an economic history of the 20th century. It is a very long book. Whereas if you're thinking about, I think your audience is also sort of a key piece of this puzzle. I work on a lot of business books, and business books tend to be shorter because the people reading them are often more pressed for time. They're not necessarily academics. And so, those books tend to be like maybe like 200 pages or less, as opposed to, a book of, history or, something else that's going to be like 400, 500 pages. So it's a question of audience. It's a question of, what you're writing about, sort of how much scope do you need to give the subject its full due. I think one of the things that we often run into as editors is the idea for a book that's really just an article. And so I think a useful thing to think about too would be maybe, like write an article about your idea and then see like, all right, have you exhausted that? Or is there like more, are there more directions that you're like, oh, I could talk about this. I didn't get to do that. Then that can kind of give you an indication of like, okay, so those are the chapters, that you might write on a book on this topic. But if you're like, yeah, I've kind of said everything I need to say in an article, then congratulations, you have a really great article. But that's not a book.
Excellent. So that, I think, we've covered a whole bunch of ground. I think we've talked about, I certainly have learned a whole bunch about the entire process. I think as we sort of approach the end of this episode, one thing I want to sort of ask you just sort of very generally is, as I've been sort of circling back and back again to this idea, but the book publication process is, especially from an early career perspective, daunting, mysterious, anxiety provoking, and all of these things. And I think a lot of the things that we've said today have worked to dispel some of that, dispel some of the mystery, allay some of the anxiety. But I want to just ask if you have sort of any sort of general advice, especially to early career academics who maybe haven't really engaged in this book publishing process. What sort of things would you say to someone like that?
Yeah, so I think that something that can be really useful, even when you're just kind of at the idea stage, is to think with the book proposal in mind. And so I can talk really quickly just about, kind of what the elements of a book proposal are. There's your sort of main, like, what is your book about? And that's where you're talking about the question that you're going to answer. What's new here? What about this is important and why do people need to read about it now? And I think that's a really important question for you as a writer, as an author, to be able to answer for yourself. And then to also like have the accompanying sense of urgency of like, yes, I want to write this book, because writing a book is hard. And you need to have some level of intrinsic motivation to do it. And so picking a topic that's aligned with your own interests, and something that is going to most of the time feel fun and not like a chore, I think is a good way of thinking about it. and again, with the sort of proposal guidelines in mind, another sort of element of the book proposal is that question of audience. And I think we've talked about that a bit already. But again, to really kind of nail down for yourself first, what is this book and who is it for? And then kind of all the rest is going to follow. The other elements of a book proposal are the competition. So looking at other books that have been published, ideally, in the last few years, 3 to 5 years, and describing how your book is similar to and how it's different from. And to, not think of that as a lit review, but to instead think of it as like Amazon recommending books to you, based on your other interests. And then again, another key element of the book proposal is the author bio and information about sort of author platform. So thinking about that too. And again, it doesn't have to be like, you don't have to give a TED talk. It's great to give a TED talk, but like, that's not a requirement to publish a book. But, like maybe staying in touch with some of your friends from grad school and seeing, like where they end up, and being able to, get in touch with them and say, hey, I'm going to be publishing this book. Do you think it might be of interest to your students, or, something like that? Just like anything that you can be doing to think about, like, what connections do you have to get the word out about your book? And yeah, if you're having a day where you're like, oh, I don't have time to like actually do writing, maybe that's a day to like post a little Twitter thread about, just some of like the really high level things that you're working on in your research. And that's just a way to kind of get yourself out there and put yourself out there, and sort of have people recognize you as a source for information about this topic that you're writing about. And then, again, for the book proposal, I think one of the other things that's really important to include is an annotated table of contents. And so that's something that, again, thinking really carefully about how you're going to structure the book. How do these parts work together? Is there a logical order in which you need to read the chapters? Or if you're describing something where you can kind of talk about topics in any order, like, can you impose an order on that? Are you providing your readers with a framework? Does that framework have either some sort of chronological approach, or is there like a spectrum, that, or a continuum that sort of exists in what you're talking about? And can you structure your chapters that way? I think definitely thinking about the organization and the flow between chapters is something that is worth doing. And that can definitely help make the book feel more coherent.
Yeah, I just want to hone in on one thing that you said, which struck me, which was that, especially in the competition section, to not approach that as a lit review, because in my academically trained brain, before you even said that, it immediately went to lit review. So I imagine you probably see this quite a bit with sort of academically trained folk, where a book review ends up feeling a lot like is leaning very heavily to maybe questions of like how right my position is, how well I know the field, and so on, as opposed to maybe some of the other things that you've been mentioning, whereas sort of understanding the competition section less as a lit review and more as sort of understanding what the other books on the market are, and sort of understanding the importance of presenting yourself not just as, let's say, someone who knows things very well, but who has connections in the field and who is sort of cultivating a voice within the space. So maybe you can speak a little bit just more about that, sort of for the academics in the audience. How do we break away from thinking about the book proposal as a way to showcase our academic capabilities?
So yeah, and I think that is one of the main things that in a lot of academic writing, particularly in like a dissertation, it's all about proving yourself. And I think that for the most part, when you're writing a book, like you're writing a book, like you're an expert. And so sort of coming at it from that perspective, as opposed to like, let me show you all my work and, like, so that you can believe that I am an expert. most people picking up a book will assume that the author is an expert, and that's why they get to be the ones who published a book. And I think that's especially true for general readers. Academic monographs, particularly in fields where books are required for tenure, I think that there may be more of a feeling that you need to like continue to prove yourself. But again, like if you're up for tenure, you're an expert. The whole point is that you're like putting the the cherry on top of like what you've already done. And so I think that if you come at it from that sort of more confident perspective of like, I know things, here are the things I know, and like these are the things that you need to know. I think thinking about it with your reader in mind, and not putting yourself as like, what do I need to show so that readers will take me seriously? Just kind of assume that your readers are going to take you seriously and just focus on the content and like, what do they need to know to understand the content? I think it can sometimes be a trap of like, okay, well, first you need to have like all this history and like, we're going to spend a lot of time on the background information. And it's like, no, just get to like, what is the point that you're trying to make? And then if you need to draw in additional information, you can sort of do it at the moment. But don't ask your readers to like hold all of this like background information in their heads as they're reading, sort of dole it out, as is helpful. And again, I think that may be more useful for sort of books for general readers. For academic work, there may be advantages to having that, sort of like background. And then, I'm going to take you through my sort of contribution and what my research that's really, really cool shows us. But yeah, I think just generally positioning it as, yes, a dissertation is all about prove it. And a book is all about like, I am an expert. Here's what you need to know.
Yeah, that's, I imagine, a pretty difficult perspective change for a lot of academics. Okay, well, that's excellent. So it's incredibly helpful what you actually just covered earlier with the book proposal, sort of walking us through these different sections of talking about the topic, the significance of your project, sort of your audience, your competition, and sort of the entire sort of attitude and, let's say, philosophy of how to think about your book proposal. I think will be immensely helpful for a lot of early career academics and young scholars in particular. And potentially, especially because we've been talking so much about the differences between academic and commercial publishing, I think this could be also potentially relevant for anyone who is transitioning from sort of a more academic publishing side to a more commercial publishing side, for people who want to do a little bit more outreach and a little bit more public engagement. With that, I want to just ask you sort of if there's any sort of final parting words of wisdom as someone who's sort of worked with so many academics, worked with so many authors on in these publishing houses, for aspiring writers, for aspiring scholars who want to do more public engagement.
I mean, I think it's just like what academics are doing, particularly when it comes to engaging with the public through writing a book, is so important. I think that it's important for there to be, ideas and new concepts and new understanding of the world. And that's what gets me fired up about doing my job is, discovering every proposal I get is a chance to learn something new. And so if you approach that, sort of the book publishing process through the lens of like, what information do I want to share with the world? Like, what does the world need to know, and how can I fill that need? I think that that's a really helpful way of thinking about it. I would say too, just, good luck. It's a fun adventure. It's a wild ride. There's highs and lows. But to understand, again, that it's not about necessarily the worth or the value of your project, but about alignment between what you're trying to do and what a publisher is doing. I think that is really important to keep in mind as well.
And it does, as we've been saying again and again, it is mysterious, it is daunting, but at the end of the day, if on this adventure, there are sort of helpful people along the way, such as yourself, Emily, sort of guiding us through this entire process, clarifying things for us, making it less mysterious, less anxiety provoking. I imagine it will be an incredibly exciting and fun adventure for authors as well. So with that, Emily, I wanted to say thank you so much for your time today. This has been incredibly enlightening, even personally, as I mentioned a few times. I'm also sort of an early career academic myself. And so this has been, I think, personally helpful. And just from my experience, I know this will be incredibly valuable for my peers, for other people who are in this sort of position of wanting to bring ideas to the world, wanting to potentially write a book and sort of get their ideas out there. This has been incredibly enlightening, incredibly helpful. And thank you so much, Emily.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And it's been great to be here.